Hello there. Welcome to the Transforming Trauma Podcast, a complex trauma podcast from the NARM Training Institute. My name is Sarah Buino, and I'm a psychotherapist in Chicago and currently a NARM student, and I'm so excited to share this podcast with you all. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Institute. The Institute offers NARM practitioner trainings for mental health professionals who are looking for an advanced training in complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The neuroaffective relational model is a cutting-edge, innovative approach for resolving CPTSD, addressing attachment, development, relational, and intergenerational trauma. During this unprecedented time of our world dealing with COVID-19, we are grateful to have come together with so many of you for the recent NARM online community gatherings, and we're looking forward to our next free community gathering on May 14th. These events focus on how we can stay emotionally healthy during this time of isolation and are great opportunities to engage with the NARM material and the NARM community. We've made the replay videos from all these events available on our website so that you can access them even after the events have occurred. We hope that these are useful resources for you during this time. Please go to www.narmtraining.com/events to sign up for the replay videos. Caroline Clyborne is a psychotherapist in Austin, Texas. She specializes in working with shock trauma and developmental trauma in adults living with chronic illness. She also does both psychotherapy and coaching with parents who are raising medically complex and neurodivergent children to help parents sustainably address life stressors related to medical caregiving. Please enjoy my interview with Caroline Clyborne. Hello, Caroline. Welcome to the Transforming Trauma Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to get to know you. You're a NARM fellow friend that I have yet to meet, so this will be great for me to have a new friend.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we start off with these interviews on transforming trauma, much like we start a NARM session. So what is it that you would hope listeners would get out of our interview today?
I hope listeners would get a chance to have a little more of an understanding of what complex trauma looks like when there is an ongoing safety issue and a client is living with medical uncertainty. Treating trauma is a little different.
Mm-hmm.
And I want people to have more of an understanding of why that's significant and how that both influences the therapeutic relationship and how therapy goes, and also just their relationship with, if a lot of trauma therapy involves helping a client orient to safety, what does safety look like when you are regularly aware of threat? And the threat is legitimate and real.
Right. And that's really appropriate given the time that we're recording, which is during the pandemic. So this is not just true for your population, but true for all of us right now.
Right.
Yeah. Caroline, why don't you give us a good intro for who you are and tell us more about who you're working with?
I'm a psychotherapist in Austin, Texas, and I work with adults living with chronic illness and with parents of medically complex kids. And I only work with adults. I got interested in specifically targeting more of medical trauma and that side of things because when I was in my internship, I had been studying somatic experiencing and was interested in trauma anyway. And then I gave birth to my beautiful daughter, who was born with a chronic condition where she has trouble controlling seizures and she had a lot of medical complexity. I realized, one, that there was a very underserved population when it came to parents of medically complex kids. And I realized that what the parents were going through was very different from what the kids were going through or what the disabled population was going through. And I got really curious about how disability and how going in and out of the medical system influences the attachment relationship.
Well, I would really like to hear more about what have you noticed? What are parents of children with disabilities going through that is different, and how does that relate to trauma?
Let's start at the very beginning of the attachment relationship. So let's say you've got a mother of a neurotypical child who doesn't have a level of kind of the medical stuff going on. The mom is co-regulating with the baby, and the baby gets distressed. The baby has a wet diaper, and the mom goes in, changes the diaper, baby gets soothed, right? So first the baby cries, then the mom feels distressed, then the mom fixes the problem, and then the baby's distress goes down. Okay. So what happens if instead of that scenario, the mom changes the diaper, but the baby is feeling pain? So the baby keeps crying. So the level of distress in the mother continues to go up. And that's appropriate, right? Because the baby's alarm system is going off, it says, I have pain, come fix it. And the mom's attuning with the baby. And so the mom is feeling her distress level go up of, I need to fix it so that we can both settle down. And what if in that same situation, the mom discovers that the child has a diagnosis and she had not planned for this diagnosis? And so there's the kind of the overwhelm of all the information. And then there are a bunch of appointments, and there's the overwhelm of all the appointments. And then there's interacting with the medical system, and there's the overwhelm of all of that. And then her social system doesn't know what to do with this particular change in her life. And so instead of people coming closer, she becomes more isolated. And instead of being able to join the other moms talking about daily stressors of young kids are stressful, the things that she would share that are daily stressors are so overwhelming that people pull away.
Right. Because they don't know what to say.
They don't know what to say. What they say is, you're so strong, and then they disappear. So the mom's level of stress is going up and up and up and up and up. And the baby's level of distress is going up and up and up and up. And the mom's job is to help the baby self-regulate. And she may or may not be able to do that. Circumstantially, she may or may not be able to regulate herself. And so that is very different circumstantially than when you don't have the level of medical complexity in there. And the parent may feel frightened of the child and what the child means for the parent, of what this means for the parent's life, of things the parent visually sees happen with the child or to the child. And also there's that sense of helplessness, because theoretically, parents are there to hear the child get distressed, soothe that distress. Like, that's what they're there to do. So what does it mean to be a parent when you can't fix the problem, when you can't address the source of distress? And what will typically happen in therapy if the parent goes to see a therapist, and it's hard to convince a parent to go see a therapist because the parent often is very focused on, my child needs help, my child needs help, my child needs help. So they're wanting to go to every child appointment. They've got 1 billion child appointments potentially, and they're wanting to make sure their family is okay. If you convince them to go to therapy, they go into the therapist's office, and the therapist is trying to help the client orient to safety, because a lot of trauma therapy kind of starts that way. They're like, orient to safety, okay? And the parent will likely get frustrated and may or may not come back, because they're orienting to safety while standing in the middle of a superhighway. The threat is real. They may or may not be in a state of relative safety. And then potentially, because the therapist is in the field with the parent, the therapist may resonate with that overwhelm and have a difficult time with that as well. And so it's more a reinforcement of, do I really want to be in my feelings when my feelings are this unsafe? Maybe not. So you can see that the parent's experience and the child's experience from the very beginning, there's a big difference. And what typically happens is that there's this disability identity that both the parent and the child identify with, but they're talking about completely separate things. The parent is having a caregiver identity, and oftentimes the parent will refer to themselves as a special needs parent or some form of disability identity plus the word parent. But it's more of a caregiver identity. And similar to a soldier sees themselves as a soldier, or a ballet dancer sees themselves as a ballet dancer, because that's all that they do, right? And it's very much an identity, but it's different from a disability identity. And a disability identity, you're talking about what it's like to come into the world and potentially be received as a source of distress, and all of the things that come with any sort of physical pain that might be involved in childhood, or being othered by peers, or both having the parent kind of more in your business because of all the medical stuff
Mm-hmm.
and any sort of like protectiveness or whatever. And then also having that influence relationships with siblings, having that influence freedom, and then also having a lot of people interact with their body as a medical object. So one of the things that I found really surprising and sad with my daughter and her surgeries was having doctors come in and start touching my daughter without greeting her,
Yeah.
because she was little and nonverbal, and they were interacting with the medical object rather than interacting with the child. And part of that has been because she continues to be, for the most part, nonverbal. And so there's not an assumption that greeting her before touching her is necessary, even though it really is if you're going to have respect for the person in front of you. It's just a very different thing to go into the world and be interacted with as an object to fix rather than a person. Or to have strangers stare and have a concerned look on their faces when the child is happy. The child is just doing their thing. You know, they're very different tracks. And so I work with trauma in adults who are living with chronic illness or who have a disability identity. And then I also work kind of on the parent side, what it's like to work with that attachment, and kind of recognizing that those are very separate things to work with. There is both a level of working with shock trauma and there's a level of working with developmental trauma and working with those two populations.
Yeah. So you're working with adults. Let's stick with the parents for just a minute, because I think that's potentially likely a less visible population because everyone's going to be focused on the identified patient often, right? So if we talk about parents for a moment, when we think about developmental trauma, that starts early in childhood. But my guess is that a parent's own developmental trauma is activated then by their relationship with their child. Can you explain what that looks like? What happens? What's there?
The best way to describe how developmental trauma gets activated in parents is the same way that electricity would be activated if you dropped a toaster in a thing of water. You know, usually the parents, typically, it's not unusual for a parent to have their own childhood stuff come up when raising their child. We all kind of end up getting a certain amount of childhood stuff snagged by what our child just does or doesn't do, and that raises like grief and anger and stuff. And there's plenty of stuff to go see your therapist about, even you know, raising a neurotypical child. Okay, but it is different than the level of helplessness that can come up when working with medical stuff with your child, because often we confuse agency with power.
Yeah, say more about that.
So a parent does not have the ability to stop their child's medical problem from existing. A parent still has the capacity to parent. Often the parent can get really stuck in the overwhelm of how helpless it feels to have no power over the most significant thing in their child's life. And that is completely legit. And it can feel very similar to childhood helplessness, right?
Yeah.
And it really pulls on a lot of childhood strategies. But potentially, parents have more capacity to contain their sad feelings and their angry feelings than a child does. And it is really tricky when trying to connect with adult consciousness, when asking for the parent to show up in their adult consciousness. You cannot at the same time accidentally minimize the reality of the helplessness in the situation. And I think that's one of the things that can really come up. It can feel like one or the other, where you're either highlighting how impossible the situation is or you're minimizing it.
Well, I can only imagine, because in NARM, we recognize that the way that we relate to a situation is what potentially increases the distress. But if you were to say that to a parent with a child with a chronic illness, they might want to punch you in the face, right? So how do you
That is
approach
true.
that very tenderly, right? And hold that this really, again, this is a real threat. This is really difficult.
Right. And the analogy that I use with my clients oftentimes is to call it an apocalypse.
Mm.
You are living through an apocalypse.
Mm.
And instead of zombies coming and getting everyone, the zombies are coming to get your kid. And you are both expected to live a pre-apocalyptic life and a post-apocalyptic life at the
Mm.
same time. You have to make sure your child is physically safe, and you have to bring cookies to the bake sale. And you have to make sure that any problems that you mention to other people are within kind of the medium-sized problems. People love
Right.
talking about medium-sized problems. Oh, you got in a car accident? Oh, that sucks. I'm so sorry that happened to me. Da, da, da. People will
Mm-hmm.
join you and relate to you. They will not ostracize you or be weirded out or back up.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So you hide the large problems, hide the large grief, learn your job as fast as humanly possible, because the apocalypse is now. It's not coming in a couple of months for you to prepare for. It's here.
Right.
And it is maddening because there's both that pre-apocalyptic life and that post-apocalyptic life, and your social support is pre-apocalyptic, or you're talking to other people who are also in the apocalypse, and there's a lot of potential for secondary trauma and hearing what's going on with them. And it's very easy to become terrified by people who can actually relate. As a therapist, it's really important to be able to help the client tell the difference between the alarm that is coming from the parent and the alarm that is coming from the circumstance, and to kind of honor. This is a common analogy. This definitely didn't come from me. I stole this from somebody. Anyway, there's the whole thing about the fire alarm, right? When something is distressing, it sounds like a fire alarm in your head. And sometimes it's popcorn, and sometimes it's a legitimate fire.
That's a really great analogy. Wow.
So when you are a parent of a medically complex child, and you are aware of the fact that you are parenting a child in a house that has fires in it, and they're legitimate fires that may actually burn your kid. And when the fire alarm is going off, you want to know that the fire alarm is going off, because that's part of attuning with your child. And that's part of holding on to your sanity in some ways, because it's real. And when the fire alarm is going off, you don't have the option of moving to safety. Okay. Usually the fire alarm is helpful because the fire alarm tells you, get out of the house. You don't want to stay in a house where the fire alarm is going off. This is saying danger, right? And in this particular situation, whether or not there's danger is not an indication of whether or not you need to act. So being able to distinguish between when you're attuning with danger that requires action and when you're attuning with danger that just is really critical, especially if you're going to move out of crisis mode and into long-term lifestyle mode, so that you don't give yourself chronic health problems. In the apocalypse movie, the characters at some point get to a place of relative safety. They're still in danger, but they take turns being on watch. They don't stay awake every hour of the day, because they can't do that and fight the zombies or whatever they got to do. So they have to be able to both be aware of the fact that there's still a legitimate danger, and they have to figure out, okay, what are the checks and balances I need to have in place so that I can get forms of rest without needing to wait till the apocalypse is over to rest.
Right, right.
So
I'm writing things down because this is really brilliant. And I'm supposed to work with parents next week. And I was thinking, this is so helpful. So how do you support the parents in finding those places of rest when there is constant threat?
we go through, what do you need to keep your child relatively safe for the circumstance? If we're going to use a more broadly applicable circumstance, we are all kind of living through an apocalypse right now, right? You're going to need to be able to make sure that your kids are safe right now, and you're going to need to be able to work, and you're going to need to be able to do all these kinds of things. So what are the things that you have that are basic needs? And if you cannot keep yourself from getting exposed to the virus what is relative safety? Relative safety includes, okay, the checks and balances that you're going to accept, like I'm going to wear gloves when I touch things. I'm going to wash my hands regularly. I'm not going to touch my face. I'm going to keep 6 feet distance. And so you're going to figure out what your systems are going to be to keep relatively safe for the circumstances. And then when the alarm's going off in your body that tells you there's danger, 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 you can orient to the things that you're doing to keep yourself relatively safe, given that you can't keep yourself all the way safe. And so that allows there to be kind of an acknowledgement of that difference between there's an alarm going off and there's a fire and I got to fix the fire before I can feel better. There's an alarm going off because there's a fire, but I've done what I need to do to make sure that in this moment, I'm keeping myself from getting burned as much as I'm capable of keeping myself from getting burned, knowing that I'm not in control of preventing myself from ever getting burned, but this is the best I can do. And if I don't fully kind of touch into the acceptance of that, there will be no rest. And if there is no rest, I'm more susceptible to infection.
And that's where I imagine that NARM is so particularly beneficial, because as a therapist, we can say, okay, we got to cultivate radical acceptance here, but it's easier said than done. And what NARM helps to do is just create that space for that acceptance to arise. So can you share what that looks like with your folks?
With my clients, you start with the contract just as anyone else, and they will highlight what areas are creating the highest level of stress. And then they can explore what is driving that distress. And part of it is the circumstance. And part of it, if you go deeper, is that play between, like, what does this say about who I am as a person? What does this say about, am I capable of keeping myself safe? NARM is really great at honoring that basic human need of being able to protect yourself. And being able to protect yourself doesn't mean that you have a magic wand and you can make the world a safe place. But it's being able to do some things on your behalf that really honor your ability to be an actor in your own life. How do you want to play this? If this is true, if this is your reality, what are your values? Who are you and how do you want to play this? And that ultimately ends up being more important than the source of the distress, is feeling that sense. These are the things that are true. I can grieve the things that are true. I can feel some of those feelings without believing that feeling those feelings will cause me to completely collapse. And then act on the things that really require action. It can be a lot like being a performance athlete, because you're really having to be a performance athlete about how you metabolize the stress.
In terms of endurance, you mean?
Yeah. In terms of, hey, I can't afford to get into that fight on Facebook because that is not in my emotional distress diet. That's not approved for my diet. I don't know if you know spoon theory, but spoon theory is super helpful in terms of that as well. So in the chronic illness community, there's something called spoon theory. And it was from somebody who I think had chronic fatigue, and she was trying to describe to a friend what it was like to try and get through the day having chronic fatigue. And so they were at a restaurant. She grabbed a handful of spoons, and she's like, most people have an unlimited number of spoons, but these are all the spoons that you have for the whole day. What are you going to do when you wake up in the morning? Are you going to brush your teeth? That's going to cost you a spoon. You're going to wash your hair? Oh, that's 3 spoons. You're going to feed yourself? Oh, look, you've used up half your spoons for the whole day. And so you end up having to ration out where you spend your spoons, and know that if you run out of spoons, you're done. There's no more. And so emotionally, the parents who have medically complex kids have a limited number of spoons. There is a general level of distress all the time that takes energy. And they are having to help a child metabolize distress at a different rate than the parent who's changing the wet diaper. It's a lot more coming through the system. And so if you don't have an endless supply of spoons, where are you going to spend your spoons? How can you be a performance athlete and really be deliberate about when you're going to expend emotional energy and when you're not. And with your child's diagnosis, how much information do you need to know to keep your child relatively safe right now? Okay. Maybe there are certain symptoms that will come up when the child is a teenager that you need to be aware that things are going to change when the child's a teenager. But do you really need to be researching it right now?
When your child is 4, right?
4-year-old doesn't need that, right?
Right.
You don't have the spoons for that. And you don't need to be reading stories about what's going to happen to your child, which may or may not happen, and which are a potential source of distress. What is information that's relevant? What are the symptoms that are relevant? How can you know when you know enough? And 2, with community, there is, again, that sense of being able to connect with people who get it feels really great until it doesn't. And it is hard to know when you can't read anymore until you've kind of gone past what's okay. And I keep referring to that community. It's because one of the beautiful things about Facebook is that people with rare diagnoses and their caregivers have found each other. This is beautiful. It used to be that if you had some sort of rare condition, you couldn't find community. But now they're potentially in feed all the time. And some of that is helpful and supportive. It's really nice to be able to ask questions. It's really nice to be able to connect. And some of that really globalizes the threat. When we're talking about complex trauma, the difference between complex trauma and trauma that's simpler, that if you have a one-time event, it can feel like a fluke. If you're living with something that is recurring enough and is kind of always there, then everywhere you look at some point becomes threatening. And it gets harder to distinguish between what is safe and what is unsafe.
Right.
What is situational and immediate and true, what is historical and like was true at one point but is not actively true in this exact moment, and what is safe but you're so used to being hypervigilant that you can't even see it, you know?
I really am appreciating your passion for this population so much right now. I am learning a tremendous amount, so it's really helpful. Do you have a particular story that you can share that was either a success or a struggle for you?
Let's see. I think that a lot of my parents have their kind of different stages that we've been working through a lot. There's the stage around being able to grieve the change. I think it's very threatening a lot of times to grieve a diagnosis because it sounds like you don't love your kid. It really kind of hits in that place of, this is not the life I had planned. This is not the life I wanted. This is not what I had in mind when I was trying to get pregnant. And I love my child.
Right. Both are true.
And so it's been really beautiful watching parents figure out how to navigate that part of it, because there is a certain amount of, if you think of grief as the loss of the relationship you expected to have with someone, then you're not grieving the child, you're grieving the expectation.
Right.
Once parents get a chance to grieve the expectation, there's a lot more of an opportunity to attach in the here and now. I had a parent who was talking about just really struggling in the moment when the child was having the temper tantrum and the child was super dysregulated. Like, how do I connect in with the part that feels attachment oriented and loving? And what the parent was able to connect with was being able to enjoy the child's curly hair and being able to enjoy the fabric, because the child didn't want to be touched directly, but wanted to be touched through a blanket, being able to feel the texture of the fabric. And being able to have the story in their minds about a time when it was easier to connect and attach. Sometimes with children who are medically complex, the symptoms are not necessarily when they're in the hospital. The symptoms come when they get home. Because when they're in the hospital, there's a lot more dissociation. There's a lot more things going on. The child can be really overwhelmed, but then you get home and there can be a lot of behavioral symptoms. But there's a sweetness potentially in those moments in the hospital that can be nice to kind of bring up when the child's in distress at home. And so being able to have a memory of a moment of beautiful attachment with the child when the child is flipping out And being able to rub the back through the blanket, being able to connect with the curls, and being able to kind of orient to sweetness can be really helpful in helping the parent self-regulate to help co-regulate the child. And so I think stories like that or strategies like that are a lot about kind of, if these things are true, if I can't fix this source of the distress because the source of the distress is not in the room, or I can't fix the source of the distress because the source of the distress is in my child's body, where is my attachment to my child?
I'm sitting with it and savoring it in terms of the pandemic right now too, just really thinking how supportive that statement would be for all parents to hear right now.
If you can't fix the problem, what causes distress is more like scared plus alone. You can't fix the source of the scared. But what you can do is be able to address the alone part.
Yeah.
And part of that means the parent being able to contain the distress enough to stay present with the child. And that means really being able to like digest big picture. Reality is terrifying right now. All of our priorities have been thrown into the air and are uncertain and all this kind of stuff. What I have in front of me is a little kid. A little kid doesn't know what to do with this situation. So what do you have? Are you doing everything to keep yourself relatively safe for the situation? And what are the checks and balances that let you know that? That's super separate from the fact that there's an alarm bell going off in your head. And there's an alarm bell going off in your head because scary things are scary and dangerous things are dangerous. And you can tell that your body is reacting to dangerous things being dangerous. So you go through your sense of, okay, have I done everything I need to do to act to address relative safety right now? Okay, awesome. We are relatively safe. So that means that it is me and the child. And all I have to do right now is address the alone part. Okay, we are relatively safe. My child is in distress. We're not going to pair distress plus alone.
Yeah.
That's what's protective.
Yeah.
And it's saying, I can handle you getting as distressed as you need to get about this. You're not going to scare me one bit by being freaked out. I'm freaked out too, but I can contain my freak out and I can contain yours. And if I can't contain my freak out, we're just going to be both freaked out together.
Exactly. That just sounds so loving. I'm so excited by everything you're saying. I think it's just so beautiful. I'm curious, because you said you started out with somatic experiencing work. What led you to NARM specifically?
Well, I really wanted to address the relationship part. And I found that somatic experiencing was great at working with the shock trauma part, right? It was great at dealing with the parts that needed to be slowed down because they were just too overwhelming and addressing kind of the horror. But I found that in my own therapy, a lot of what was coming up was identity work. And I had an experience with my child that was extremely devastating, where my daughter was having 15 seizures a day, and she had brain surgery to try and stop her seizures. And there were complications from the brain surgery, and she was half paralyzed by the surgery. And then 9 days later, the seizures came back.
Oh my God.
And so she was having 15 seizures a day and was half paralyzed. We were in the hospital 33 days. I had a 5-year-old who was away from his mom. We came home from the hospital. My 5-year-old was super angry with me. And my daughter had 10 appointments a week, and insurance was fighting paying for them. So I was spending an ungodly amount of time on the phone fighting with insurance. And so not only had my worst fear happen to my child, and I was completely helpless to do anything about it, but I wasn't able to protect either child.
Right.
And the world didn't care. And I was devastated and I was angry. And I honestly, there was a moment where I really almost had like an out of body experience where I was like, I am a parallel track of the person that I was, but I will never be the same. My worldview, my whole sense of self has been ripped to the foundations. Like I do not live in the same world that I lived in before. I am not the same person. I will never be the same person. This is complete and utter devastation. And I was just trying to figure out how to self-regulate in waiting rooms full of other distressed parents and their kids who were running laps around, whatever, and all the siblings who get stuck in waiting rooms. And it was just too much. And it wasn't just too much in a shock trauma kind of way, but it was too much in a sense of in a hitting me in a self place. And then I was working with a therapist who was doing really good work from a by the book kind of standpoint, but was asking me to orient to safety.
Yeah.
He's like, there's nothing safe about this.
Right.
My whole sense of self is gone. There's no room for me to have a self. And both kids need me. And I can't fix any of the problems that are here. So what now? And so there was just a need for some form of therapy, for me to learn more forms of therapy to fit in my tool belt for when I did get back to seeing clients. And that wasn't, I took several years off to just do medical stuff with my kid when I went through it myself. But when I did come back, I knew that I needed something that addressed sense of self and identity in a way that honored both history and kind of present tense distress. And NARM really offered that, because NARM addresses historical stuff without causing the client to go back in time and relive a lot of that stuff. And it's very much highlighting resources kind of modality, which was critical for my population, because one of the things I was thinking about is, okay, every time my client leaves my office, my client needs to be able to go fight zombies in the apocalypse. They need to be able to be 100% on. They can't have the kind of session that causes them to need some time to process before they can get back to baseline. And NARM really has a lot of room for keeping the client functional and not having those similar kind of dips that you can have when you're working through a session where you're reorganizing things. And it also, I think it's really important when you're working with a population that deals with a lot of helplessness in day-to-day life, to have a modality that's so much, that really is calling for the adult and the client. Because there's a difference between being in a low position of power and feeling helpless due to that low position of power, and actually not having anything that you can do. This is a little bit of a tangent, but this is a super important story. Okay, there was this woman in the news who was a blind woman who was standing up at a convention talking about women in Africa. And she had been raising her hand in the meeting for 2 hours and no one called on her. And they closed the Q&A. And the crowd allowed her to speak. And she said, it's funny. I'm the blind woman, but y'all haven't seen me for the last 2 hours. And she said, blind women have it a lot rougher than women in Africa, because we're more likely to be raped. We're more likely to be living in poverty. We have fewer resources. It is worse. And when we are talking about women in Africa, we need to address intersectional issues, like the intersection between disability and gender. And it was the comment of the conference, and the article focused on it being the comment of the conference. Okay. But I'm a NARM therapist, so I was asking myself, okay, well, where was her agency? Because the article wanted to really highlight the fact that other people had allowed her to speak. But that had nothing to do with her. That wasn't her agency at all. Her agency was in her holding on to the truth and being able to stand that unstandable thing and keep her hand up. That was an act of endurance.
Yeah.
And it would have been very easy to put her hand down and feel despair.
Right.
Like, these people don't get it. They're never going to get it. And that's ultimately what matters, right? And even the article was focused on something that was completely out of her control. That was not what was inspirational. It was not inspirational that other people bothered to call on her.
Right.
It was inspirational that she bothered to get there. And that even when circumstances were not reflecting back to her that the truth was true, that she was able to know the difference between what was circumstantial and unavoidable, and what was circumstantial, and the group really needed to be responsible for that.
Mm-hmm.
And what was kind of her own trauma history, la la la. So she knew she wasn't acting out her baggage. She was showing that the truth was the truth. That was the agency.
Yeah.
Woman in a super low position of power. I don't know. That's a low position of power, but she had agency.
Yeah.
That was not offered to her.
Right.
That came from her. That's what I'm working with my clients to do.
That's a beautiful story to end on here. And I want to thank you too for sharing your own personal experience of what you've been through and how that has supported your work with clients too. I hear the passion, and I'm just very appreciative of everything I've learned today. And I'm sure the audience has learned a lot too.
Thank you. I'm happy to be a part of this, and thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. If you want to learn more, you can go to the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. The Transforming Trauma podcast is brought to you by the NARM Training Institute. NARM practitioner trainings for mental health professionals are offered across North America and internationally. We are so excited to share the power of healing from complex trauma with all of you. Your listenership means a lot to us on the Transforming Trauma team. Do you feel inspired to help bring greater trauma healing to the world? If so, we'd like to invite you to share the Transforming Trauma podcast with others. It might not feel like a significant contribution, but we believe every share and every additional listener matters. You can be part of the trauma-informed movement just by sharing our podcast with your colleagues, friends, and family. Our intention is to make this trauma work accessible to individuals and communities around the world who are suffering, so that they have support, guidance, and a friendly reminder that healing from complex trauma is possible. Thank you to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.